you really get a sense from our announcements of the kind of work that this place is engaged in, the kind of justice work that goes on here, and it's truly exciting. I just want to highlight for 1 second our loss of Clayton Wilson. Clayton and Dawn have been grandfathers of this congregation, together 62 years. And certainly long before the inclusion of the United Church in 1988, this congregation was inclusive, welcomed them, and they, in turn, welcomed us. Dawn, we love you, and we'll be there with you. Last week, I spoke about my internship experience, and I thought that I might update you a little bit and talk about my very first pastoral charge, which was in Brucefield-Kippen, which is a small little town. If you blink, you drive through it. It's close to Lake Huron. Wonderful people, extremely rural. Everyone in my congregation were farmers. We had absolutely nothing in common with each other when I was settled there, and I wouldn't have gone had it not been for the United Church. So kudos, United Church. You made me go to rural Ontario, and I loved it. So it just proves. But they were very different. They were very different from city folk. And in one way that they were different was the way they conducted meetings. Most of us here, have been through meetings of various sorts. Well, their board meetings went like this. Each person that was head of a committee would give their report. And for example, if it was worship, the report would be like this: worship was wonderful, end of report. If it was the building committee, they would say, the building is still standing, end of report. If it was the finance committee, it would be, we broke even last month, end of report. All of our meetings in Brucefield-Kippen lasted for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. If they went to 30 minutes, it was because we were gossiping about folk who weren't in the room. And then the important part happened. The chair would hit the gavel, she had a gavel, and she would say, lunch. And then we would all break and have lunch for the next hour and a half. And lunch was 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock in the morning. Lunch was food whenever. So in that way, they were very different from city folk. They were also very different from city folk in the way they looked at money, because they were all farmers, as I said, and they sat on many millions of dollars worth of land. And they worked really hard, especially in harvest season. And they drove beat-up old cars, and they lived in beat-up old houses for the most part, and they didn't dress in the latest fashion. And so one day at Bible study, I decided to broach the topic because I was this city slicker. And I said, you know, I just don't get the way you folk handled money. I said, if you were city people, you would sell some of your land, cash in those millions, you would buy a BMW, you would drive down south somewhere and sit on the beach and have a margarita. And the folk at my Bible study were mainly women and sort of older than 75, and they all looked at each other and, you know, as if they'd never even thought of this, which was surprising to me. And after a minute of kind of whispering to each other, one of them said what they all thought, then what would we do? It's a beautiful answer, because they didn't see their work as this daily grind, something they did to put food on the table. They actually saw their work as meaningful. It defined them. It was who they were. And their church was their family extended, and their community. They could not imagine a life without meaningful work and community. Faith was their security. I want to share with you some spiritual truths. These are from all faiths, not just the Christian faith. Number one, you can choose to live with a sense of abundance, or you can choose to live with a sense of scarcity. Number two, and this is important, you become what you hate, or you become what you love. Number three, you bring about what you fear, guaranteed, or you bring about what you dream, guaranteed. Number four, if money is an issue, if you experience a scarcity of funds, then the answer spiritually is to be more generous with the money you do have. Next one. If you need something done, ask the busiest person you know. That way, you're assured it'll get done. And if you feel drained of time and tired because you've got so much on your plate, donate more of your time. That's the answer to that. And what do you do? And what happens when you do these things? The world shifts. When you stop worrying about your own security and you start caring about the world's welfare. You know, the greatest threats to our world are not climate change or climate crisis or nuclear war or anything else we can imagine. The greatest threat to our existence on this planet is this sense of insecurity, this fear, this sense that we have to hoard what we have and that we cannot share with others. And that leads to the twin devils of apathy and cynicism. That's the greatest threat to our existence. And finally, to sum it all up, the only faith, the only security we have is faith. And that, our faith, is our security. That's it. So I'm going to share some stories, quick ones. I remember two elderly parishioners at my last church. One had a lot of money, found herself alone in a huge house with lots of precious artifacts and jewelry lying around it. She had a caregiver that came in every day. She was worried that the caregiver was stealing from her. She had no way of monitoring that or stopping it. And her kids were in cities far away. She didn't have anyone around her in the home, and she was frightened of people breaking in while she was alone. Very insecure. There's another elderly woman who was also part of our congregation, who was an active churchgoer. She didn't turn up on a Sunday. She got a call on a Monday. She lived in one room. She had nothing. She didn't have any children. But the community was her security. She didn't worry about losing anything. She didn't worry about theft. She was secure, had nothing to do with money. When I had my business in the 80s and made a lot of money, I worried. I was insecure because my business depended on billings every month. And if our billings weren't at a certain level, I was concerned about my business. And I was concerned about my employees and their welfare. And there was always a sense of insecurity. When I was in political life, there was always the next election. You were never sure if you'd get your job back. There was always something about to happen, or you get caught up, or something insecure. In this job, in faith communities, never a problem, always secure. All of our friends just about come from faith communities and are in faith life, and we know that our family will be looked after if something were to happen to us. There's an old joke about a man who tithed to his church. He gave 10% of his take-home pay. He was very poor. He only made $100 a month, and so he gave the church $10 a month. And then he got both creative and lucky, and he started his own business, made $10,000 a month within a short period of time. This caused him some concern. He went to the minister and he said to her, he said, you know, when I gave $10 a month, that made sense, but now that I'm making $1,000, that's a lot of money to give to the church. And the minister in her wisdom said, I hear you, let us pray that you go back to making $100 a month. Annis was a Guyanese woman in my last congregation. She came up here with nothing, her child, hoping to meet her husband. Turns out her husband had already left her and the child alone. She had nothing. She cleaned houses for a living and had a terrible time. And she told us a story, and she said she phoned her mother back in Guyana and said, you know, things are awful here. I wish I'd never left Guyana. And her mother said to her, woman of faith, said, Annis, has God put a roof over your head today? And she had to admit that yes, crummy roof, bachelor apartment, but yes. And then her mother said, and Annis, have you eaten today and have you fed your child? Not, you know, 5-star restaurants, but she had to admit they had enough food. Her child had eaten. And then her mother said, well, Annis, the only question for you is how are you going to repay God and give thanks? Faith is our only security. That's faith speaking. Abundance versus scarcity. That's what we listen to today. Disciples, dense as always in the Bible, didn't see abundance when it was swimming all around them. They were living in scarcity. They were living in fear and insecurity. And it took Jesus to come along and say, you know what? There's lots of food. Don't worry. Fear not, he said. If you are making above the poverty line in Canada, know this: you are among the wealthiest 1% in the world. And if you are here at all, if you exist, you are a 1 in a trillion chance. You are a miracle of existence just because you are. That's abundance. So this Stewardship Sunday, the only real question is this: will we rejoice in our abundance, our lives, our time, our talent, our resources, and choose generosity, or will we fear and feel insecure? Fear not. Faith is our security. We have everything. Just like Jesus said, we have everything and more. We have won every lottery that's held around the world. That's who we are. We are so blessed. We are so fortunate. We are so lucky. That's who we are. So the only question really is, how are we going to spend it? Who are we going to be generous with? And how are we going to live our lives? Thanks be, and amen.